The alarm was already screaming when Nurse Cassidy Vance drove her palms into the stranger's chest for the 14th time. Blood on the floor, ribs cracking, a flatline that refused to move. And then the CEO of Harlow Regional Medical Center walked into that trauma bay, looked straight at the man dying on the table, and said 4 words that would change everything. Stop, get her out. Not because the patient was beyond saving, because investors were watching through the glass. What happened next, what Cassidy did, what she refused to stop doing, and what that decision cost her, is the kind of story most hospitals would rather bury. They couldn't bury this one. If this story already has you on edge, you're exactly where you need to be. Follow along to the very end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The snow had been falling since 4 in the morning, soft and indifferent, the kind that muffled everything outside. While inside Harlow Regional Medical Center, the world moved at a completely different speed. Cassidy Vance had been on her feet for 9 hours. She wasn't supposed to be. The shift rotation had her clocking out at 6, and she'd actually made it as far as the locker room. Coat on, badge half unclipped, before the radio on the wall crackled with the kind of transmission that turned her around without thinking. Trauma incoming. Male, 40s, unknown origin, vitals crashing in the ambulance. ETA 4 minutes. She didn't make a decision. Her body just stopped moving toward the door. That was the thing about Cassidy that most of the administrators at Harlow didn't understand and probably never would. She wasn't performing dedication. She wasn't angling for recognition or a commendation in her file. She simply could not leave when someone was about to come through those doors needing everything the department had, because 9 hours or 18, exhausted or not, she knew what she could do, and she knew what happened when the wrong person was standing at that bedside instead. She dropped her coat on the bench and walked back out. The ER at Harlow Regional sat in the southeastern corner of the hospital's ground floor, a wide, fluorescent-lit space that smelled like antiseptic and burned coffee, and something underneath both that never quite went away, no matter how hard the cleaning crews worked. Millhaven, Colorado, was a mid-sized city that liked to describe itself as a gateway town, close enough to the mountains to attract weekend hikers and seasonal tourists, large enough to have a real hospital system, small enough that Harlow's ER handled everything from frostbite to farming accidents without the luxury of specialized backup always being 30 seconds away. Cassidy had been working there for 3 years. Before that, she'd done her nursing degree on a compressed timeline, working nights at a distribution center to pay for it. Before that, and this was the part of her history she didn't exactly broadcast at staff mixers, she'd spent 4 years attached to a forward surgical unit in the Army, working alongside combat medics in environments where the phrase, "we don't have that equipment," was just a fact you adapted around, not a reason to stop. She was 33 years old, and she looked unremarkable if you weren't paying close attention. Medium height, dark hair pulled back tight, scrubs that fit like she'd washed them 100 times, because she had. She had steady hands and a voice that went very flat and very calm when situations escalated, which some people found reassuring and others found unsettling, depending on which side of the situation they were on. The ambulance bay doors blew open at 6:14 a.m. The paramedics came in fast, rattling off stats in that clipped, overlapping rhythm that meant things were genuinely bad. The man on the gurney was large, broad through the shoulders, maybe 6'2", and he'd been found at the edge of the Millhaven Overpass access road, collapsed in the snow with no wallet, no phone, no identification of any kind. He was wearing civilian clothes, but they were military cut in the way that wasn't fashion. Work pants, a thermal base layer, boots that had seen real terrain. His blood pressure was in the basement. The attending physician on duty that morning was Dr. Raymond Osei, a solid, unhurried man who'd been at Harlow for 12 years and had the particular kind of calm that came from having seen almost everything. He took one look at the vitals printout and started directing traffic before the gurney had fully cleared the bay doors. Cassidy slotted into her position without being told. That was the rhythm she and Osei had developed. Not quite friendship, not quite the formality of pure professional relationship, something in between that worked because they both respected efficiency more than protocol theater. "BP?" she asked, pulling on gloves. 60 over palp, the paramedic said. "We had him at 70 briefly, but he dropped again about 2 minutes out." "Breathing?" "Labored. He was conscious for maybe 40 seconds when we first got to him. Said something we couldn't make out. Went under before we could get anything else." She looked at the man's face. There was something guarded in the structure of it, even now, unconscious and half blue from the cold, a tightness around the jaw, a particular quality of stillness that wasn't quite the same as someone who'd simply collapsed. She'd seen that look before, in other contexts, on other faces, and she filed the observation without acting on it. Not yet. They worked. For the first 17 minutes, it was controlled chaos of the best kind. The kind where everyone in the room knows exactly what the next move is, where the communication is spare and precise, where the equipment lands in hands before it's asked for because the people in the room have done this enough times that the whole thing has its own momentum. Then his heart stopped. Not a dramatic crash, just a line going flat on the monitor with a tone that cut through everything else in the room and made the temperature drop by about 10 degrees. "He's in V-fib," Osei said, already moving. "Starting compressions, Cassidy." She was already there. She positioned her hands, locked her elbows, and began. CPR is not gentle. The textbooks are honest about this if you read them carefully, and the reality is more brutal than even the textbooks quite manage to convey. Effective compressions, the kind that actually circulate blood, the kind that keep tissue alive while the heart is doing nothing, require force. Real force. They require pushing down 2 inches into an adult male's chest at a rate of 100 compressions per minute, and they require sustaining that force without letting up, without slowing, without softening when the resistance changes, or when the sounds coming from the patient's body become sounds that make people in the room look away. Cassidy did not look away. She had learned this in a forward operating base on hard dirt with an instructor who had told her, flat and without apology, that if she went soft in the middle of compressions, she was going to watch someone die slowly instead of saving them quickly, and that the body she was trying to save did not care about her discomfort. She had never forgotten that. About 4 minutes in, she heard it, the distinct, muffled crack of cartilage giving way under her hands. Costochondral junction, stress fracture in the rib. It happened. It happened in effective CPR with grown men, and it was not an error, it was physics. And the right response was to maintain depth and rhythm and not catastrophize. She maintained. She did not catastrophize. What she did not see, because she was completely focused on what was in front of her, was the door at the far end of the trauma corridor opening, or the group of people who walked through it. Harlow Regional's quarterly investor review had been scheduled for weeks. CEO Garrett Hollis had organized it himself, which meant it had been organized with the particular obsessiveness of a man who understood, on a molecular level, that his continued position at the top of a mid-sized regional hospital depended not on clinical outcomes, those were someone else's department, but on the perception of clinical outcomes, the perception of stability, the perception of Harlow Regional as the kind of institution where things ran smoothly, where corridors were calm, where the overall atmosphere communicated competence and not the grinding, exhausting, often chaotic reality of what it actually took to keep a hospital functioning at capacity in a city this size. Hollis was 51, silver-haired in a way that looked curated, and possessed of the particular brand of confidence that came from never having had to personally be present for the consequences of his decisions. He'd come up through hospital administration, finance, then operations, then executive, and he genuinely believed, in the way that people believe things they've never been forced to examine, that the most important factor in a medical facility's success was how it presented itself. He had brought 6 investors through the corridor outside the trauma wing because the layout was impressive from the outside, wide, well-lit, the kind of architectural detail that photographed beautifully in annual reports, and because he'd timed the tour to avoid the early morning intake rush. He had not accounted for the emergency admission. He had not accounted for any of it. The glass panels along the corridor gave the investor group a clear sightline into Trauma Bay 2, and what they saw through that glass at 6:31 in the morning was Cassidy Vance standing on a step stool to get better leverage, driving her full weight into compressions on a man who was arguably the largest patient currently in the building, while Dr. Osei called out intervals and a second nurse managed the crash cart, and the monitor screamed with the particular urgency of a machine that had been designed to communicate exactly this kind of situation. They also saw, if they were watching closely enough, the slight flex in the patient's rib cage that indicated the compressions were working, that blood was moving, that tissue was being kept viable, that the protocol was functioning the way it was supposed to function. Garrett Hollis did not see any of that. What Garrett Hollis saw was a woman who looked, to his eye, like she was assaulting a patient. What in the... He turned to the administrator walking beside him. Who authorized this? Why is that happening in front of... He gestured at the investors with a movement that managed to be both discreet and furious. Sir, that's an emergency resuscitation. I can see what it is. I want to know why it's happening here, in full view. Because that's where the patient is, the administrator said, and then seemed to immediately regret saying it out loud. Hollis straightened his jacket. He looked at the investors. 3 of them had stepped closer to the glass, watching. One of them, older man, military straight posture, name tag that read A. Hartwell, hadn't looked away from the bay at all. Hollis made a decision in the space of about 4 seconds. He pushed open the door to Trauma Bay 2. The shift in the room was immediate and involuntary. Not panic, nothing as dramatic as that, but a reorientation of attention. Hollis walked in with the energy of a man who owned the space, which technically he did, and that energy landed differently in a room where someone was actively dying on the table. Dr. Osei. His voice was controlled, carefully, deliberately controlled. Osei looked up once, registered who was standing there, and looked back at the patient. Sir, this isn't the best time. I need this bay cleared. A beat. A very specific kind of silence. Excuse me, Osei said. The tour. The investors are in the corridor. I need this. Hollis paused, visibly recalibrating. I need this situation relocated or resolved, immediately. Cassidy kept her hands moving. She was at the 2-minute mark of the current cycle, and her arms were burning in the way that arms burned when they were working correctly, and she was not going to stop because a man in a suit had walked into the room with an agenda. We're in the middle of a resuscitation, she said, without looking at him. Hollis turned to look at her like he'd just noticed she was there. And you are? The person keeping this patient alive. So unless you're here to help, I need you to step back. Something moved through Hollis's expression, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, surprise maybe, or the specific irritation of a person who wasn't accustomed to being spoken to that way by someone at her level in the hierarchy. I'm the CEO of this institution, and he's your patient. He's also in VFib with a BP that was 60 over PALP 20 minutes ago. And if I stop compressions right now while we wait for the rhythm to correct itself, he's going to die, sir. She added the last word not as deference, but as punctuation. Osei had gone very still in the way that doctors went still when they were watching a situation develop and hadn't yet decided whether to intervene. Hollis looked at the man on the table, at the monitors, at Cassidy's hands still moving, still maintaining depth and rate, with a mechanical precision that was, if you were paying the right kind of attention, remarkable. Then he looked back at her and said, with complete evenness, "Stop the compressions." The room went quiet in a different way. The imaging from this department is going on the Foundation's promotional materials next quarter, Hollis continued, his voice dropping to something almost conversational. The investors outside that glass are deciding whether to commit $7 million to Harlow's expansion. What they are currently seeing is not something I can allow to represent this hospital. Cassidy looked up at him then, just once. A look that was entirely without anger, which somehow made it worse. He'll die, she said. I'll accept that clinical outcome. She heard Osei draw a breath, and then Hollis did something that crossed a line so clearly, so unambiguously, that it would later be described in 3 separate incident reports with almost identical language. He stepped forward and put his hand on Cassidy's shoulder to physically pull her back from the bedside. Military instinct doesn't announce itself. It doesn't pause to consider. In the span of a second and a half, Cassidy shrugged his hand off her shoulder with a force that rocked him sideways, pivoted back to the patient, adjusted her grip, and resumed compressions. Don't touch me while I'm working, she said. It was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was simply the flattest, most certain sentence in the room. Hollis stood there, slightly off balance, face going through several colors. "You're done in this hospital," he said. "Do you understand me? You are finished. Badge, scrubs, and out of my building in the next 10 minutes. "Fire me tomorrow," she said. "Charge me with insubordination. Write whatever you need to write. But right now I'm at 3 minutes 40 into this compression cycle, and I need the defibrillator ready because in about 20 seconds we're going to try again." Osei moved to the crash cart. Hollis did not move at all. "Charging," Osei said. "Everybody clear." The room held its breath. The defibrillator discharged. On the monitor, the flatline stuttered. Once, twice, and then, with the particular reluctance of something that had been forced rather than invited, resolved into a rhythm. Ragged and slow and too thin, but a rhythm. Cassidy stepped back from the bedside. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she noted without concern, because that was simply what happened after sustained compressions, and she pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed out through her nose. "He's got sinus rhythm," Osei said, and his voice had something in it that she would think about later. Relief, yes, but underneath that, something that sounded almost like awe, which embarrassed her slightly to consider. She looked at Hollis. He was already on his phone. He fired her in the corridor. Not privately. Not in an office with HR present and documentation and the professional courtesy of a closed door. He fired her in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 2 with 2 security officers flanking him and the investor group still partially visible through the corridor glass, because Garrett Hollis had decided in the 30 seconds between the patient's heart restarting and his call to security that the most important thing he could do was demonstrate control. "Badge," he said. She unclipped it and held it out. He didn't take it himself. He nodded to the security officer on his right, who stepped forward and took it from her hand. "You'll be escorted to the locker room to collect your belongings and then out of the building. Any medical equipment remains hospital property." She looked at him for a moment. She had the disorienting experience of feeling almost nothing. Not the hot rush of outrage she might have expected, not the collapse she could feel the edges of somewhere behind her sternum, just a kind of cold clarity. The same clarity she'd felt in other situations, in other places, when things had gone irreversibly wrong and the only useful response was to be completely present for what came next. "He needs to be monitored overnight," she said. "His BP was still unstable when I stepped back. Someone needs to—" "That's no longer your concern," Hollis said. She nodded. That was all she gave him. The security officers walked her to the locker room. She changed in silence, collected the small number of things she kept in her locker. A spare hair tie, a granola bar she'd been ignoring for 3 days, a paperback she carried everywhere but rarely opened, and put them in a plastic bag the security officer handed her. She didn't pack dramatically. She didn't make it into anything. In the parking lot, the snow was still falling. Her car was on the far end of the lot, and the walk to it took approximately 4 minutes, which she spent with her shoulders straight and her pace deliberate and her mind doing the thing it always did in crisis, which was to break everything down into a sequence of manageable next steps. Call her landlord, check her savings, update her license registration, look at travel nursing registries. She did not think about the man on the table. She knew, on some level, that thinking about him was where she would lose it, so she stored him somewhere she could access later and kept moving. Her car started on the 3rd try, which was normal for January in Millhaven, and she sat in the driver's seat with the heater running and the windows fogging and her hands finally still in her lap, and she thought, okay, what's next? She was 3 miles from the hospital when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She almost didn't answer. But she was stopped at a red light, and there was something about the prefix. Local, but not local in a way she could place. And she picked up. "Ms. Vance." Not a question. A statement, like whoever was on the other end already knew she'd answer. "Who is this?" "My name is Sergeant First Class Dara Nkosi. I'm calling on behalf of people who have a significant interest in the patient admitted to Harlow Regional at approximately 6:15 this morning." A pause. "We understand you were involved in his resuscitation." She stared at the red light. "I was. And we understand you were subsequently removed from the hospital." That's accurate. Ms. Vance, another pause different from the first. Can you tell me his current condition? He had a return to sinus rhythm. His pressure was unstable when I was taken off the case. I don't know anything beyond that. Understood. A third pause, and then, is there anything else you can tell us about his presentation when he came in? Anything that might help us understand what happened to him? She thought about the boots, the thermal layer, the military cut of the clothing that wasn't quite civilian, the particular stillness of his unconscious face. Who are you asking on behalf of? She said. There was a sound on the other end of the line that she couldn't quite identify. Movement, maybe, or someone else in the room shifting position. Someone who will want to know you kept him alive, Nkosi said finally. We'll be in touch. The line went dead. The light turned green. Cassidy sat there for exactly 3 seconds before the car behind her tapped its horn, and she drove. She spent the rest of the morning in her apartment trying to work, which mostly meant sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop open to a nursing job registry site and her coffee going cold while she stared at the blinking cursor in the search bar and couldn't quite make herself type. The apartment was small but organized in the way that her life had always been organized. Not neat in a fussy way, but everything with a purpose and a place, because that was how she'd learned to live, and it was hard to unlearn. She had a corkboard above the desk where she'd been working on her recertification courses, and a window that looked out onto the street where the snow was still coming down, slower now, the kind of gentle, constant fall that in other circumstances she might have found peaceful. Her phone buzzed 3 times in the first hour. 2 were from colleagues at Harlow. Short, careful texts that were clearly written by people who were worried about HR looking at their messages. The third was from Dr. Osei, and it just said, "He's stable, moved to ICU." And then, a minute later, "For what it's worth." She stared at that for a while. She was making her 3rd attempt at actually completing a job search when the news alert hit her phone. She'd set up a local news alert for Harlow Regional months ago after a story about equipment shortages had broken in the regional paper, and she'd wanted to stay ahead of whatever came next. The alert that came through now was different. It was from a city desk reporter at the Millhaven Gazette, and the headline was a single blunt line: Millhaven police investigating unidentified man found near Overpass Road. Hospital sources, military affiliation suspected. She read it twice. Then she opened her contacts and called the number that Darren Nkosi had called from. It rang 4 times. No one picked up. She put her phone face down on the table and looked at the snow. Whatever was coming, from Hollis, from her employment status, from the phone call, from the man whose ribs she'd cracked at 6 in the morning, it was already in motion. She could feel it the way you felt a weather system before it arrived, a change in pressure rather than anything visible. She picked up her phone again. This time she dialed Osei. He picked up on the second ring. "I saw the news alert," she said without preamble, a pause on his end that told her he'd seen it too. "Yeah. Do you know more than what they printed?" "Not officially." "Raymond." Another pause. Osei was many things: careful, methodical, deeply good at his job, but he was not a man who lied well, which was something she'd always liked about him. "They found identification in his boot," Osei said. "Not a wallet. Something else." She waited. "Cassidy." His voice dropped. "Whatever you did this morning, it wasn't just a resuscitation." She looked out the window. A truck was moving slow down her street, its tires leaving twin tracks in the fresh snow. "What kind of identification?" she said. But Osei had already said more than he'd planned to say. She could hear him pulling back. "Just don't go anywhere," he said. "I have a feeling things are going to move fast." He hung up. She set the phone down. The snow kept falling, soft and indifferent, and somewhere across the city, in a room on the ICU floor of Harlow Regional Medical Center, a man she didn't know the name of was breathing with lungs that were working because she had refused to step back. And somewhere, she didn't know where, but somewhere close, people who knew exactly who he was were already moving. The call came at 11:47 that night, not from Nkosi, not from Osei, from a number with a Denver area code that Cassidy didn't recognize, and the voice on the other end was male, clipped, and spoke with the economy of someone who had spent years communicating in situations where wasted words had consequences. Ms. Vance, my name is Major Elliot Carr. I'm calling on behalf of Colonel Voss's command. I understand you were the primary responder this morning. She was sitting on her couch in the dark with a glass of water she hadn't drunk, still in the same clothes she'd worn home from the parking lot. She'd been attempting to sleep for 2 hours and had managed approximately none of it. Colonel Voss, she repeated. The patient admitted to Harlow Regional at 06:15. I can't give you more than the name right now. Is he alive? A beat. He is. Stable, as of 2 hours ago. The ICU team upgraded his status to guarded. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Okay. We need to understand something, Carr said. The physician on record, Dr. Osei, listed you as primary on the resuscitation report, but you were removed from the hospital before that report was filed. That creates a documentation problem. That creates more than a documentation problem, she said. Yes. The word was flat and unornamented. We're aware. We're also aware of the circumstances under which you were removed. We've spoken with 3 staff members at Harlow Regional in the last 4 hours, and we have a fairly detailed picture of what happened in that trauma bay. Another beat. What I need to know from you directly is whether you are willing to make a formal statement. She looked at the window. The snow had stopped some time after 8, and the street outside was quiet and white and still. About what specifically? About what the CEO of that hospital ordered you to do while a patient was in cardiac arrest. She thought about Hollis's hand on her shoulder, the even, almost boardroom calm of his voice when he said, I'll accept that clinical outcome. The particular way he'd looked at the investors through the glass, checking, recalibrating, managing the optics of a man dying on a table 30 feet away. Yes, she said, I'm willing. Good. Someone will contact you tomorrow morning with a time and location. Get some sleep if you can. He hung up. She didn't get any sleep. The location turned out to be the Millhaven field office of the Inspector General's division, a nondescript building on a commercial street downtown that she'd driven past 100 times without ever looking at it directly. The appointment was at 9. She arrived at 8:52 in the clothes she'd selected the way she selected anything that mattered, practically and without theater. Dark slacks, a gray wool pullover, boots that had seen more serious situations than a federal office interview. Major Carr in person was younger than his voice suggested, mid-30s maybe, with the kind of face that gave very little away. He had a woman with him whose name he gave as Captain Reyes, and a civilian from the Hospital Regulatory Division of the State Health Department named Sobol, who wore reading glasses and had a notepad, and who said very little but wrote a great deal. They were in a conference room with bad lighting and a table that was slightly too large for the space. There was coffee. She took a cup because she'd slept for maybe 90 minutes, and the alternative was falling asleep in a federal office, which she was going to avoid if she had any say in the matter. They asked her to walk through the morning from the beginning. She did. She was specific about times, about clinical observations, about what was said and by whom and in what order. She had a good memory for crisis sequences. That was a skill that had been trained into her, and it held now, precise and chronological, without embellishment. When she got to the part where Hollis said, I'll accept that clinical outcome, Reyes stopped writing for a second. Just a second. Then kept going. He used those exact words, Carr said. Not a question. Those exact words. And then he physically contacted you. He put his hand on my shoulder and attempted to pull me back from the bedside. And your response? I removed his hand and resumed compressions. Sobol looked up over his reading glasses. That's a significant physical response to a superior. He's not my superior in a clinical setting, she said, and physically pulling a nurse away from an active resuscitation is an interference with emergency care. I responded to that interference. Sobol wrote something down. She couldn't read it upside down and didn't try. The interview lasted 2 hours and 10 minutes. At the end of it, Carr walked her out to the lobby and said, with the same economic precision he'd used on the phone, what you did in that trauma bay is not in question here. What happened to you after is. She looked at him. What does that mean, practically speaking? It means we're not done, he said, "and it means you should hold off on accepting any other employment until you hear from us again." She drove home with that sitting in her chest like a stone she hadn't decided what to do with. The story broke on the second day. Not the full story, not yet, but enough. The Millhaven Gazette ran a piece online at noon with the headline, "Nurse Fired After Saving Unidentified Patient at Harlow Regional, Sources Say," and it had enough specifics that it was clearly sourced from someone inside the hospital. The comments were what comments always were, which was a mix of outrage and skepticism, and people who had strong opinions about hospital administration based on no particular expertise. But the piece itself was careful and accurate, and it named Hollis by title, if not by his specific words. By 3 in the afternoon, 2 local TV stations had picked it up. By 5, a regional health advocacy account with 80,000 followers had shared it with the caption, "A patient's heart restarted. A nurse got fired. A CEO kept his job." This is the story. Cassidy found out about all of this from a text from her friend Priya, who worked in hospital administration 2 cities over and had a habit of sending links with no context and then calling 30 seconds later. "Okay, so your name isn't in it," Priya said when she picked up. "I know, but it's obviously you." "I know that too. Are you okay?" She thought about it. The honest answer was complicated, and she was too tired for complicated, so she said, "I'm fine. I'm dealing with it." "Do you have a lawyer?" She didn't. She hadn't thought that far yet, which in retrospect was probably an oversight, but the last 48 hours had involved rather a lot of decisions in compressed time frames, and that one had slipped through. "I'll look into it," she said. "Cassidy. Priya. You saved someone's life and got fired for it. You need a lawyer, not a to-do list." That was fair. She wrote it down. She was 3 names deep into a search for employment attorneys who handled healthcare cases when her phone buzzed with an alert she wasn't expecting. It wasn't the news. It was a Harlow Regional internal communication forwarded to her from a current staff address she recognized. A junior nurse named Marcus, who she'd trained 18 months ago, and who apparently had decided that whatever HR might do to him was worth it. The communication was from Hollis. It was addressed to all department heads, and its subject line was addressing recent external inquiries, and it was, in the particular language of institutional self-protection, a masterwork. It described the termination as a result of insubordination and breach of professional conduct protocols. It framed Hollis's presence in the trauma bay as executive oversight during a high-stakes patient event. It said the hospital was cooperating fully with any relevant regulatory inquiries in a way that made cooperation sound like it was their idea and not something being compelled from outside. It did not mention the cardiac arrest. It did not mention the defibrillator. It did not mention, at any point, what the patient's condition had been when Cassidy arrived at his bedside or what it was when she was escorted out of the building. She read it twice. Then she forwarded it to Major Carr's number with no message. He responded in 11 minutes. "Received. Thank you." Then, after another 4 minutes, "Don't speak to press yet. We're close to something." She put the phone down and looked at the ceiling. Close to something was not a phrase that narrowed things down particularly well, and the version of her that had been awake for most of 48 hours was running low on the patience required to sit with ambiguity. She was not a person who fell apart easily. She had been in situations where falling apart was genuinely not an option, and had developed, over years, a fairly robust capacity to function under pressure without touching the part of herself where the pressure was actually accumulating. But there were limits, and she was aware, in a dull, tired way, that she was getting close to one. She made dinner, she ate it. She called her mother in Phoenix, who didn't know the details but knew something was wrong because Cassidy called on Sundays, and this was Thursday, and who asked 3 careful questions and then said, in the voice of a woman who had raised her daughter through harder things than this, "You know what you did was right." "I know," Cassidy said. "Then the rest of it is just noise." She went to bed at 10, and this time she actually slept. The black vehicles arrived at Harlow Regional at 7:45 the following morning. She wasn't there to see it. She found out through Marcus, who sent her a text that was just, "There are military people here. Like, a lot of them. What is happening?" She called Osei. He picked up in one ring, which meant he'd been waiting for her call, which meant he'd already seen. "How many?" she said. "4 vehicles. I counted at least 8 personnel. One of them is a brigadier general. I saw the insignia. They went straight to the executive suite." He paused. "Hollis has been up there for 20 minutes. She sat down on the edge of her bed. "Raymond." "Yeah." "Is Voss still in ICU, still stable?" "They went up there first, actually. The general did. Spent about 15 minutes in the room before he went to the executive suite." She thought about that. A brigadier general visiting a man in a hospital ICU before going to confront the CEO, who had tried to have that man's resuscitation stopped. The sequence of it was deliberate. The sequence of it was a message. "What's the general's name?" she said. They didn't announce it, but one of the staff looked up the insignia. "Brigadier General Helena Marsh." Osei's voice was careful. "She apparently oversees Special Operations Command for this region." Something landed in Cassidy's chest that she couldn't quite name. Not relief. Too early for relief. Not satisfaction. That wasn't the right word either. Something more like the recognition of a system working the way systems were supposed to work and almost never did. "Cassidy," Osei's voice dropped. "I heard what you said to him, in the trauma bay. I was standing 6 feet away." She didn't respond. "If this goes where it looks like it's going, I'll testify to that. Whatever they need. I should have done more in the moment, and I didn't, and I've been thinking about that." "You kept your hands on the patient," she said. "That was the right call. It wasn't enough. Raymond, it wasn't your fight to pick. It was mine, and I picked it." A long pause on his end. "You're a strange person," he said finally, but there was something in it that wasn't an insult. "I've heard that." She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand and tried to figure out what to do with herself for what might be the longest morning of her life. She was still working on that when her doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. She went to the door with the specific caution of someone who had been living under a particular kind of uncertainty for 3 days, looked through the peephole, and saw a woman in dress uniform standing on her front step with a precision of posture that was immediately, unmistakably, military. She opened the door. The woman was in her 50s, compact and still, with the kind of face that had done its work and bore evidence of it. The rank insignia on her uniform matched what Osei had described. "Ms. Vance?" said Brigadier General Helena Marsh. "I'd like to talk." Cassidy looked at her for a moment. At the uniform. At the 3 vehicles parked at the curb that she hadn't noticed until right now. "Come in," she said. She stepped back from the door, and as Marsh crossed the threshold, something in the air of the apartment changed. Not dramatically, not with any visible signal, but in the way that the atmosphere of a room changes when the person entering it carries real weight, real authority, the kind that didn't require a title because it came from something less transferable than rank. Cassidy led her to the kitchen table. She offered coffee because it was what you did, and Marsh accepted with a single nod, and they sat across from each other in the pale winter light coming through the window while Cassidy poured 2 cups and tried to read a face that had been trained over decades not to be readable. "Colonel Voss is going to recover," Marsh said, before Cassidy had sat down. "Fully, as far as his doctors can tell. The damage from the cardiac event was manageable, because of what you did." "I did my job," Cassidy said. "You did considerably more than that." Marsh wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. Her hands were scarred across the knuckles, which Cassidy noticed and filed without comment. "You also did it after being ordered to stop by the chief executive of the facility." "Yes. That's a serious act." "Stopping would have been a more serious one." Marsh looked at her steadily. "I've spent the last 2 days reading your file, your employment record here, your service record before that." She paused. "You were attached to the 214th Forward Surgical Team for 31 months. "Yes." "I know that unit. I know what they were asked to do and where they were asked to do it." A beat. "You left the service voluntarily." "I did." "Can I ask why?" It wasn't a question she answered often, not because it was painful. It had been years. The sharp edges had worn down into something manageable, but because the answer was long and personal, and most contexts didn't warrant the full version. She looked at Marsh across the kitchen table, and decided that this one did. I had a situation, she said, toward the end of my third deployment. A patient we lost, not because of anything clinical, but because of a command decision about transport prioritization that put resources somewhere else. Someone made a calculation. The calculation was wrong. And She stopped. I didn't handle how I responded to that particularly well. I stayed in for another 8 months, but I was done. I knew I was done. Marsh listened to all of this without moving. The incident, she said, was it documented? Yes, in a way that was not entirely favorable to me. And yet your nursing record at Harlow is flawless. People change contexts, Cassidy said. Marsh nodded slowly. Then she set down the coffee cup and leaned back slightly in the chair, and the quality of her attention shifted in a way that was subtle but distinct, like a lens pulling back from close focus to something wider. I'm going to tell you something that isn't public yet, Marsh said, and I'm telling you because you're owed it, not because I need anything further from you. She met Cassidy's eyes. Garrett Hollis's actions in that trauma bay are being reviewed by the State Health Department's Emergency Care Oversight Division. We accelerated that review. The hospital board has been formally notified of the review's existence, which they were not happy about. Cassidy wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. There's also the matter of the surveillance footage, Marsh continued. The trauma bay has a camera, standard protocol. The footage from that morning captures everything from Hollis's entry to your removal, including the physical contact, including what he said. The kitchen was very quiet. He said it on camera, Cassidy said, every word. She thought about that for a moment, about Hollis in that room with his curated silver hair and his investor tour and his complete absolute certainty that he was the one with the power to define what mattered and what didn't. She thought about him saying, I'll accept that clinical outcome with the calm of a man who had never in his life been the one lying on the table. What happens next? She said. Marsh looked at her with the directness of a person who had long ago decided that the kindest thing you could offer someone was the truth delivered cleanly. That depends on a few things, she said, including what you want. Cassidy opened her mouth to answer. Her phone lit up on the table between them. She glanced at it automatically. A reflex, and the name on the screen made her stop. It was Marcus. The text beneath his name was 4 words, and they were capitalized, which Marcus almost never did, which meant his hands were probably shaking when he typed it. Hollis just called security. And then, 3 seconds later, a second message. On the board members. Cassidy showed Marsh the phone. The general read the 2 messages once, set the phone back on the table with the deliberate calm of someone who had learned long ago that the first response to unexpected information was rarely the right one, and stood up. Where's your coat? She said. They were in the first vehicle inside of 4 minutes. Cassidy sat in the back seat with Marsh beside her and watched Millhaven move past the windows at a speed that the driver managed without drama, threading through the morning traffic on Caldwell Avenue toward the hospital with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been given implicit authority over the road without needing to announce it. The 2 other vehicles followed. Nobody in the car said anything for most of the drive, which Cassidy appreciated because she was thinking. What Hollis calling security on his own board members meant, in practical terms, was that he'd lost the internal calculation. A CEO who was managing his position from a place of strength didn't escalate against the people who held his contract. He negotiated. He maneuvered. He called lawyers and arranged careful conversations and bought himself time. Calling security on board members meant he'd already run out of the moves that required subtlety. And what was left was force, blunt, clumsy, and almost always self-defeating. It also meant the board had shown up without warning, which meant someone had told them to. She thought about Marsh sitting across her kitchen table, saying, I'm going to tell you something that isn't public yet, and realized she'd been watching one half of a coordinated sequence without recognizing it as such. Marsh had come to her apartment not only to tell her about the footage and the regulatory review. She'd come to keep Cassidy occupied and informed while something else was already happening at Harlow Regional. The timing was not accidental. None of this had been accidental. She looked at Marsh. The general was looking straight ahead. You called the board, Cassidy said. A beat. The Inspector General's office made certain information available to individuals with fiduciary responsibility for the institution. That's a careful way to say yes. The corner of Marsh's mouth moved. Almost nothing. It's an accurate way to say yes. The scene at Harlow Regional's main entrance was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. No raised voices, no visible confrontation, nothing that would have looked like anything to a patient or visitor walking through the lobby. But to someone who knew what to look for, the tension was structural. It was in the way the security desk staff were standing slightly too straight, in the way the two officers near the elevator bank weren't making eye contact with anyone, in the way the receptionist at the main desk was on the phone with a fixed expression that meant she was relaying information upward while trying to appear entirely normal. Marsh walked through the lobby with 4 personnel behind her. Cassidy walked beside her, which she suspected was deliberate. Marsh could have had her wait in the vehicle, and she hadn't, and in Cassidy's experience, people with that much situational awareness didn't make incidental choices. They took the elevator to the 4th floor. The executive suite at Harlow Regional occupied most of the floor's east wing, glass-walled conference rooms, a reception area with expensive furniture that nobody ever seemed to be using, and at the far end, behind a set of heavy doors, Hollis's personal office. The heavy doors were open. Inside the conference room adjacent to the office, Cassidy counted 7 people around the table. 4 she didn't recognize, board members, she guessed, from the particular look of people who were accustomed to authority but were currently encountering something outside their usual range of problems. One was the hospital's chief medical officer, Dr. Paulette Rhee, who Cassidy had interacted with twice in 3 years, and both times came away with the impression of a woman who was very intelligent and very careful about when she deployed it. One was the hospital's legal counsel, a thin man named Fairchild, who was already on his feet when they walked in. And at the head of the table, still in his suit, still with the curated composure that Cassidy was beginning to understand was the only consistent thing about him, was Garrett Hollis. He saw Cassidy before he saw Marsh. Something crossed his face. It was brief and not quite readable. Not fear exactly, more like the recalibration of a man who had just realized the geometry of the room was different from what he'd planned for. Then he saw the uniform. General Marsh. His voice was professionally even. I wasn't aware you'd be attending today's. I'm not attending, Marsh said. I'm here on behalf of Colonel Voss's command, and I have some things to say that I'd prefer everyone in this room to hear. Fairchild cleared his throat. General, any communication related to pending regulatory matters should go through Mr. Fairchild. Marsh didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Sit down. He sat down. One of the board members, a woman in her 60s with short silver hair and the composed expression of someone who ran things professionally, looked from Marsh to Hollis and back. General, I'm Sandra Ellery, board chair. We were in the middle of a governance conversation when Mr. Hollis called building security on the people who hold his contract, Marsh said. Yes, I'm aware. She looked at Hollis. That was a significant miscalculation. It was a security response to unauthorized access to an executive meeting, Hollis said. A board meeting is not an executive meeting. The board owns this institution. You work for them. Marsh set a folder on the table. This is a summary document prepared by the Inspector General's office. It covers the events of January 9th from 6:15 to 7:02 a.m. in Trauma Bay 2. It includes timestamps, clinical records, and a transcript of the surveillance footage from that room. She paused. I'll give everyone a moment. The room was very quiet while people opened folders. Cassidy stood near the door and watched faces. Rhee read with the speed of someone who already knew most of it and was confirming details. Ellery read slowly, with the focused attention of a person building a legal argument in real time. The other board members moved at different speeds, and the quality of their silence changed as they got further into the document. One of them, a heavy-set man in his 50s who hadn't introduced himself, stopped on what Cassidy guessed was the transcript page. He read something, then he read it again. Then he looked up at Hollis with an expression that was not anger, exactly, but was something worse than anger. It was the look of a person realizing they'd been represented by someone they didn't actually know. Garrett, he said, did you say this? Hollis's jaw tightened. That's taken out of context. It's a direct transcript. There was a clinical situation that was being managed inappropriately. It's a transcript, the man said again. Of you telling a nurse to stop CPR because investors were watching. Is that what happened? The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. The clinical staff was acting outside established protocols, Hollis said, and the precision of the language was itself a confession. It was the language of a man constructing a defense, not answering a question. Dr. Ree closed her folder. Cassidy Vance's protocol adherence during that resuscitation was textbook. Everything she did was within scope. The rib fracture was an expected outcome of effective chest compressions on a large adult patient. The patient's return to sinus rhythm happened because of her actions. She looked at Hollis. Not in spite of what you did. Despite it. Hollis turned to Fairchild, which was the move of a man who had run out of other moves. Fairchild was already writing something and did not look up. Cassidy had not expected to be in that room. She had not expected, when she woke up that morning, to be standing 6 feet from the man who had taken her badge and told her to leave while it was still dark and snowing, while he addressed the people who held his career in their hands. She had not arranged this and had not asked for it, and the fact that she was here was entirely because a woman in a general's uniform had said, "Where's your coat?" and moved fast. She was aware, standing near that door, that she was doing something she didn't entirely have a handle on, which was feeling. Not performing composure, not managing optics, but actually feeling the accumulated weight of the last 3 days pressing on a specific place behind her sternum that she'd been keeping locked since the parking lot. She kept her face still. She was good at that. But her hands, at her sides, were not quite steady, and she noticed that without apology. Hollis was talking again. He'd shifted registers. The boardroom composure was cracking at the edges, and what was coming through was something raw and less managed. He was talking about liability, about institutional risk, about the regulatory environment facing mid-sized regional hospitals, and the pressure of maintaining operational optics during high-stakes funding periods, and the words were all real words that described real pressures, but the context he was applying them to was so catastrophically wrong that every sentence made things worse. "The decision I made in that room," he said, "was a risk management decision. I assessed the clinical situation and the broader institutional stakes, and You told her to let him die," Ellery said. Flat. No inflection, just the fact. The room went still again. That is the precise clinical consequence of stopping CPR on a patient in VFib without an established alternative intervention. Ellery closed her folder. "I've served on 3 hospital boards. I've sat through more regulatory reviews than I can count. And I have never, in any context, encountered documentation that looks like this." She looked at Cassidy, and it was the first time she'd looked directly at her since they entered the room. "Ms. Vance, you were terminated the morning of January 9th. "I was," Cassidy said, "and you were terminated while the patient whose life you just preserved was still in critical condition in the adjacent room." "Yes." Ellery looked back at Hollis. Something in her face had resolved, the deliberate neutrality of someone who had been waiting for confirmation before drawing a conclusion and had now received it. "Garrett," she said, "I need you to step out." The hallway outside the conference room had the antiseptic quiet of administrative spaces that rarely saw anything urgent. Hollis walked out ahead of his legal counsel and didn't look at Cassidy as he passed her, which was a choice she recognized as conscious. He was managing even now, controlling what he gave away, unwilling to hand her even the acknowledgement of direct eye contact. She watched him go without moving. Major Carr appeared from around the corner of the corridor. He'd been there, she realized, probably since before she arrived. He fell into step beside one of Marsh's personnel, and the two of them exchanged something brief and quiet that she wasn't meant to hear. Marsh came out of the conference room 2 minutes later and stood beside Cassidy. "Ellery's calling an emergency session," she said. "Board only, no executive staff." "How long does that take?" "Depends on what they already know going in." Marsh glanced sideways at her. "They knew a fair amount going in." Cassidy nodded slowly. "What about Voss?" "He's been asking about you." She hadn't expected that. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Gratitude expressed through channels, maybe, the official and distant kind, but the directness of it surprised her. He's conscious enough to ask questions? He's been conscious enough to be difficult since yesterday morning, which his team considers a very good sign. A beat of something that might have been dry humor. He's not an easy patient. Most of the ones worth saving aren't. Marsh looked at her again with that focused quality that Cassidy was starting to recognize as evaluation. Not cold, not calculating, but the steady assessment of someone who was building an understanding of a person from available evidence. When this is resolved, Marsh said, and it will be resolved today, there's going to be a conversation about what comes next for you. I want you to actually think about what you want, rather than defaulting to whatever feels most practical. What I want is, don't answer now, Marsh said. Think about it. They put her in a side room with a chair and a window and another bad cup of coffee while the board session ran. Carr came by twice with updates delivered in the compressed shorthand of someone who respected her enough not to dress up bad news or inflate good news. The session was running long, which could mean difficulty or thoroughness, and was probably both. Hollis had requested to address the board directly, which the board had declined. His counsel had submitted a written statement, which the board had received and apparently read with the specific attention of people looking for inconsistencies. At 20 minutes past noon, Ricci appeared in the doorway. She looked tired in the way of someone who had been tired for longer than the immediate crisis. A cumulative kind of tired, the kind that lived in the muscles rather than behind the eyes. She was carrying a tablet, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before she came all the way in and sat down across from Cassidy in the other chair. "How are you holding up?" Ree said. "I'm okay." Ree looked at her the way doctors looked at people who said they were okay. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "I was aware, before the 9th, that Hollis's management style in clinical situations was problematic. There had been incidents, smaller ones, choices that compromised patient care at the margins in ways that were deniable." She set the tablet on her knee. "I documented them. I didn't escalate them. I told myself I was managing the situation by staying close to it, and what I was actually doing was making peace with something I shouldn't have made peace with." Cassidy thought about what to say to that and settled on, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I testified to it this morning, to the board and to the regulatory reviewers. And I need you to know that before you hear it from somewhere else." Ree paused. "Also because you were one of the best nurses in this department, and you got thrown out of the building for doing your job perfectly, and I watched it happen, and I didn't stop it." "You had your hands on the patient," Cassidy said. "That's the same thing Osei said." "We had a similar vantage point." Ree looked at the window. Outside, the sky had the low white quality of a day that couldn't decide whether it was done with snow or not. "The board's going to make a decision in the next hour. I've been asked to give a clinical recommendation on staffing needs for the trauma unit, which is a very polite way of being asked whether I want you back." Cassidy went very still. "And," she said, "I told them the trauma unit stabilization rate has dropped 4% since the 9th. Which is statistically significant for a department this size in a 3-day window. I told them that's partly staffing volume and partly the specific loss of your skill set at the senior level." Ree looked back at her. "I also told them that if they were serious about the trauma expansion proposal that's been on the strategic plan for 2 years and keeps getting deferred, they needed someone with the clinical authority and the operational instinct to actually run it." The sentence landed in the room and sat there. Cassidy stared at her. "That's not a floor nurse position." "No," Ree said. "It's not. I've been a floor nurse for 3 years. You've been a floor nurse who functioned as an informal department lead for 3 years because the formal structure around you kept under-delivering. I've watched you. Hollis didn't, but I did." Ree picked up the tablet. "Don't decide anything right now. The board has to vote first. And then there's the regulatory side, which has its own timeline, and none of this is simple. But I wanted you to know the conversation that's been happening." She left, and Cassidy sat in the chair by the window with her cold coffee and tried to hold all of the moving pieces of the last 4 days in some kind of coherent order, and mostly failed. She thought about the man on the gurney at 6 in the morning, blue from the cold, no identification. Nobody in that room knowing yet who he was or why it mattered or what the radius of consequence would be from the decision she made in the next 30 seconds. about whether to listen to the man in the suit. She'd known, in that moment, exactly nothing about any of that. She'd known his blood pressure was crashing and his heart had stopped, and she knew how to keep blood moving, and she'd done it. The rest of it, the board session upstairs, the regulatory review, the cameras, the general inner kitchen, all of it, was downstream of that one decision, which had not been a complex decision. It had been the only decision available to her, and she had made it, and the complexity was everything that came after. She was still sitting with that when her phone lit up again. This time it was a number she didn't recognize with a Millhaven exchange, and when she answered, the voice on the other end was not Carr, or Marsh, or Osei, or Priya. It was low and rough and slightly slurred in the way of someone whose medication wasn't quite wearing off yet, and it said, "Is this the nurse who cracked my ribs?" She closed her eyes briefly. "Colonel Voss," she said, "I've been trying to get someone to give me your number for 2 days." A pause, and the sound of movement that suggested he was attempting to sit up and probably shouldn't have been. "They kept telling me you weren't on staff." "I'm not, at the moment." "I know that now." Another pause. "I wanted to say something to you." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'm saying it anyway." His voice steadied slightly, like he'd found a position that didn't hurt. "I've been in situations where someone made a call that kept me alive, and I never got to tell them that I knew what it cost them. I don't want to do that again." She was quiet for a moment. The side room was very still. "Are you in pain?" she said. "Significant amount, yes." "Is anyone monitoring you right now?" "There's a very tired-looking ICU nurse outside my door who I believe is also keeping a list of complaints to report to whoever is in charge of my care." "That's her job." "I'm aware." A sound that might have been a laugh converted at the last second into a wince. "Are you coming back to this hospital?" "I don't know yet." "You should," he said, "for whatever that's worth, coming from the person whose ribs you broke." "It's worth something," she said. "Rest. Stop trying to sit up." "How did you—" "Because I can hear it in your voice." She paused. "Lie down, Colonel." A brief silence. Then, "Yes, ma'am." She ended the call and sat there with the phone in her hand and the low winter light coming through the window, and felt, for the first time in 4 days, something that was close to solid ground. The board session ended at 1:47. She knew because Marsh appeared in the doorway at 1:51 with Ellery behind her, and Ellery walked into the room with the direct, contained energy of someone delivering a verdict they're at peace with. "Ms. Vance!" Ellery sat down in the chair Ree had vacated. Marsh stayed standing near the door. "The board has voted on 3 resolutions in the last 90 minutes. I want to walk you through them in order." Cassidy nodded. "First resolution?" Ellery folded her hands on the table. "Garrett Hollis's contract as CEO of Harlow Regional Medical Center has been terminated, effective immediately, for conduct unbecoming an executive officer and for actions that directly endangered patient welfare. He's been asked to vacate the executive suite by end of business today. Security will facilitate that if necessary." The words dropped into the room with a weight that Cassidy felt physically. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but something more complicated. The acknowledgement that something real had happened and that someone was being held responsible for it. "Second resolution," Ellery continued. "The board has formally requested that the State Health Department's regulatory review include a full audit of executive interference in clinical operations over the past 36 months. Dr. Ree has agreed to provide documentation from her records, and 3 other physicians have come forward with relevant incidents." Cassidy looked at her. 3 others. "It wasn't the first time," Ellery said, and her voice had an edge to it that was clearly directed somewhere Cassidy wasn't. "We should have known sooner. We didn't. That's its own problem that this board will address internally." She paused, and when she spoke again, something in her manner shifted. Not softer exactly, but more deliberate. "Third resolution," she said. "The termination of your employment on January 9th has been classified as wrongful dismissal under the Colorado Healthcare Whistleblower Protection Act and the hospital's own emergency care protocols. You are entitled to full reinstatement with back pay and a formal apology entered into the institutional record." Cassidy looked at the table. "There's more," Ellery said. Dr. Ree has put forward a proposal for a restructured trauma division directorship. The board has provisionally approved funding contingent on finding the right person to lead it. She met Cassidy's eyes. She recommended you specifically. So did the Inspector General's office, on the basis of your service record and your clinical performance. So, for what it's worth, did General Marsh. Marsh, by the door, said nothing. I want to be clear, Ellery continued. This is not an offer extended out of obligation or optics. It's an offer extended because the people who know this department believe you're the right person for it, and because what happened 4 days ago exposed a structural failure that we need to correct with something more than a personnel change at the top. She paused. You can take time to consider it. There's no pressure on timeline. Cassidy was quiet for a long moment. She was looking at the window, the low white sky, the city outside it, the ordinary specific reality of Millhaven on a January afternoon, which was where she had come to rebuild something she'd partly dismantled and partly lost, and which had turned out to be more complicated and more consequential than she'd expected when she took the job. I don't need time, she said. Ellery waited. But I have conditions. A flicker of something in Ellery's expression, surprise, and then, quickly, the recalibration of someone who is revising a judgment upward. Tell me, Ellery said. The trauma unit's equipment requests have been deferred for 2 years. I have a list. That list gets reviewed and approved before I sign anything. She kept her voice level. The nursing staff in the ER have been running understaffed for 18 months. That gets addressed structurally, not through individual schedule manipulation. And I want Dr. Osei's role formalized. He's been functioning as de facto department lead with a title that doesn't reflect it, and that gets corrected. Ellery was writing. Anything else? She said. Not today, Cassidy said. But I'll have more. Ellery looked up from her notes, and for the first time since she'd walked into the room, she smiled, brief and genuine and a little rueful, like someone recognizing something they'd underestimated. I expect you will, she said. Diet. She went to see Voss at 3 in the afternoon. ICU protocols were strict about visitors, and she wasn't technically staff yet, but Marsh had cleared it, which was apparently something Marsh could do, and the ICU charge nurse who walked her to the room had the resigned efficiency of someone who had spent the last 48 hours managing an unusual number of people in uniforms, asking about one specific patient, and had reached a pragmatic peace with the situation. The room was small and institutional and full of monitors and the particular smell of the ICU that was part antiseptic and part something underneath it you learned not to think about. Voss was propped up at an angle that was probably 20 degrees less than he'd attempted when they talked on the phone. He was larger than she'd registered in the trauma bay, broad and substantial, mid-40s, with the kind of face that had been weathered by something more than age. There was a bruise across his left jaw and some sutured laceration work above his ear that wasn't hers. He looked at her when she came in. You're younger than I expected, he said. You're more intact than I expected, she said. He made a sound that was more pain than amusement. Sit down, please. You standing there is making me feel like I should come to attention. She pulled the chair close to the bed and sat. For a moment, neither of them said anything, which was fine. She'd spent enough time in medical spaces to know that silence wasn't always an absence of communication. I don't remember much before I went under, he said. I remember cold. The road. Waking up for maybe 30 seconds in the ambulance. He looked at the ceiling. I remember someone saying he's going into VFib in a tone of voice that told me that was bad. It was. And then nothing until I woke up here with approximately 8 people staring at me and my entire chest feeling like someone had driven a truck over it. The compressions. I know. He looked back at her. I've seen CPR performed. I know what it takes. A pause. I'm told they ordered you to stop. Yes. And you didn't? No. He was quiet for a moment. Whatever he was thinking moved across his face in a way that was controlled but not entirely hidden. She'd gotten the impression, from what Marsh had said and from the brief phone call, that Voss was a man who was not accustomed to being in positions of obligation, and that this particular one was sitting with him in a complicated way. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you, he said. For 2 days. Everything sounds inadequate. Then don't try to make it adequate, she said. Just say what's true. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, a recognition, maybe, of a person who communicated the same way he did. Thank you, he said, for not stopping. She nodded. Once. You were my patient. I know, Marsh told me you said that. He looked at his hands, which were resting on the blanket with the particular stillness of someone managing pain. She also told me what it cost you. It cost me 3 days, Cassidy said. I'll survive 3 days. It cost you more than that, and you know it. She didn't answer that. Not because it wasn't true. It was, and she knew it, and the cost had been real in ways she was still working through, but because it wasn't the part that mattered most to her right now, and she wasn't interested in letting it become the center of the story. Are you going to take the directorship? Voss said. You know about that. Marsh tells me things, he paused. She also tells me things are still moving on our end. The formal investigation into what Hollis did, the documented interference with your termination. There may be additional steps that require your involvement. She nodded. You okay with that? Yes. He watched her for a moment. You know, when I woke up and they told me what had happened, all of it, not just the medical part, but the rest of it, my first instinct was anger. He said it without drama, like a person reporting data. I don't like that someone used my medical condition as leverage against another person. I don't like that the system that was supposed to protect you didn't. The system eventually worked, she said, after it failed you first. She didn't dispute that. After it failed me first, she agreed. He seemed to appreciate the directness of it. He shifted slightly in the bed, and the monitor beside him registered the movement and settled again. Get some rest, she said, standing. Your ribs are going to hurt more tomorrow when the swelling peaks. I'm aware of the biology. I know. I'm saying it anyway. She was at the door when he said her name, not Ms. Vance, not the title, just her first name, which told her someone had given it to him, and she turned. Whatever they offer you, he said, ask for more. You earned it. She looked at him. In the pale light of the ICU room, propped up against hospital pillows with bruises on his jaw and monitors on his chest, he looked like what he was, a person who had nearly died and knew it, and who was working out what that meant. I already did, she said. She walked back down the corridor toward the elevator, and the hallway was empty and quiet and ordinary in the way that hospital hallways were always ordinary except when they weren't, and she pressed the button and waited and listened to the building breathe around her. The beep of monitors, the distant sound of a PA system, the particular sustained hum of a place that never fully stopped. The elevator opened. Inside it, looking straight at her, was Garrett Hollis. He had his coat on, a box under one arm, his badge. She noticed this with a specific, cold clarity, was already gone from his lapel. Neither of them moved for a second. Then Hollis stepped forward to exit the elevator, and Cassidy stepped back to let him pass, and for one brief window they were 3 feet apart in the corridor outside the ICU. The man who had taken her badge and told building security to walk her out into the snow, and the woman he'd decided was replaceable. He didn't look at her. She didn't look away from him. He walked past her toward the exit, the box under his arm, his shoes making the particular sound of someone who was doing everything he could to look like he was walking somewhere rather than away from something. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the elevator, pressed the lobby button, and as the doors slid shut, she pulled out her phone and called Ellery's number. Ellery picked up on the second ring. I'm in, Cassidy said, but I need that equipment list reviewed before end of week. I'll have the procurement committee on a call by Friday morning. Good. She paused. There's one more thing. Go ahead. The nurse who forwarded me Hollis's internal communication, Marcus Reyes. He took a risk doing that, and I don't want it held against him. Silence on the other end for a moment. That's already been handled, Ellery said. We're not in the business of punishing people for transparency. Not anymore. The elevator doors opened on the lobby floor. Cassidy stepped out into the wide, fluorescent-lit space. The reception desk, the visitors moving through, the ordinary, specific reality of a hospital functioning at capacity on a January afternoon. And as she walked toward the main exit, something on her left caught her attention and stopped her cold. Near the corridor that led to the administrative wing, a cluster of people she didn't recognize. 3 of them in civilian clothes, moving with the purposeful quiet of people who were trying not to draw attention and drawing it anyway. One of them carrying a hard case the size of a carry-on bag, moving not toward any patient area, not toward administration, but toward the service corridor that connected the main building to the East Wing Annex, where the hospital's data infrastructure was housed. She stood very still. One of them glanced up. Just for a second. Their eyes met hers and then moved on, which was a specific kind of not looking that she recognized from very different contexts in very different places, and it landed in her chest like something cold. She pulled out her phone. She called Carr. He didn't pick up. She called Marsh. 3 rings. 4. On the 5th ring, Marsh picked up, and before Cassidy could speak, Marsh said, "Where are you right now?" Lobby. Main building. There are 3 people moving toward the East Wing service corridor. "Do not follow them," Marsh said. Her voice had changed quality entirely. "Walk to the main exit, go to the vehicle at the curb, the black one. Get in and stay there." "What's Cassidy?" The use of her first name was specific and deliberate. "Move now!" She was already moving. Behind her, somewhere in the corridor she'd been watching, she heard the service door open and close. And then, from somewhere deeper in the building, not loud, not the dramatic crash of something cinematic, but a sound that was wrong in the way that sounds were wrong when they came from where sounds shouldn't come from, there was a single, distant electronic tone. The kind of tone that meant something on the hospital's network had just gone offline. She made it to the main exit in 40 seconds. The black vehicle was exactly where Marsh said it would be, idling at the curb with its hazards off and a driver who unlocked the door before she reached the handle. She got in. The door closed. The lobby disappeared behind tinted glass, and she sat in the back seat and breathed and tried to assemble what she'd just seen into something that made sense. It didn't quite make sense yet. 3 civilians. A hard case. The service corridor to the East Wing Annex. The electronic tone that followed. Not an alarm, not a crash cart signal, not anything she could place in a clinical context. A system going offline was the closest she could get to naming it, and even that was a guess built on instinct rather than knowledge. She called Marsh again. Picked up in 1 ring this time. "Are you in the vehicle?" Marsh said. "Yes. What's in the East Wing Annex?" A pause that was not the pause of someone who didn't know the answer. Hospital data infrastructure, network routing, the server cluster that manages electronic patient records, billing, and Marsh stopped. Monitoring integration. Cassidy went very still. "ICU monitoring integration," she said. "Yes." The word landed between them like something physical. "Voss is in the ICU," Cassidy said. "I know, we're already moving." Marsh's voice had the clipped precision of someone managing multiple things simultaneously. "Stay in the vehicle. I mean that. If someone takes the monitoring system offline while he's, Cassidy, I have people in that building. Stay put." The line didn't go dead, but Marsh stopped talking, and Cassidy sat in the back of the vehicle with the phone against her ear and listened to the ambient sound of someone doing something urgent at a distance. Movement. A voice that wasn't Marsh's saying something she couldn't parse. A door. Outside the tinted window, Millhaven was its ordinary afternoon self. A couple crossing at the light with a stroller. A delivery truck double-parked on the near corner. The sky still white and low and non-committal. Inside the vehicle, it was very quiet. The driver hadn't turned around once. 4 minutes passed, which felt substantially longer, and then Marsh came back. "We have them," she said. "All 3? "All 3. East Wing, second junction. They hadn't reached the server room." A breath. Controlled, but a breath. "They had equipment consistent with network intrusion. The hard case you observed contained signal jammers and what appears to be a hardware tap device." Cassidy pressed her fingers against her knee. "Who are they?" "We don't know yet. That's being determined." Marsh paused. "What I can tell you is that the timing relative to Hollis's termination is not something anyone is treating as coincidental." She thought about that. About Hollis walking out of the elevator with his box and his missing badge, and his controlled, even stride toward the exit. About the 3 civilians she'd seen moving through the lobby maybe 4 minutes after that. He made a call, Cassidy said. That's one hypothesis. Is it a good one? Another pause. It's the one we're currently working with. Oh, they brought her back inside at 2:20, which was enough time for the East Wing corridor to have been cleared and documented, and for Carr to have set up in one of the hospital's smaller conference rooms with a digital recorder and the specific organized energy of someone who had shifted into a different operational mode entirely. He looked at her when she walked in and said, without preamble, "Walk me through exactly what you saw in the lobby. Start with where you were standing." She did. She was precise about angles, timing, the quality of the eye contact that hadn't been eye contact. Carr recorded it and asked 3 follow-up questions and wrote 2 things down, and then he looked at her across the table. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Incident reports from a forward surgical unit look different from civilian ones," she said. "But the skill transfers." He nodded. "The 3 individuals are in federal custody pending identification. 2 of them had documentation that doesn't hold up to preliminary verification. Third one isn't talking." He folded his hands on the table. "We found communications on one of the devices. Encrypted, but not well. Our people are working through it." "Does it connect to Hollis?" "I can't tell you that yet." He met her eyes. "What I can tell you is that Hollis has been detained for questioning. He hasn't been arrested. But he's not going home tonight." The word detained sat in the air of the conference room differently than all the other words that had been in it. She hadn't expected that. Not because it was undeserved. She'd stopped having opinions about what Hollis deserved somewhere around hour 36, when the energy required to sustain outrage had simply run out and left something colder and more durable in its place. But because the speed of it caught her off guard. 3 days ago, she'd been in a parking lot in the snow with a plastic bag and a dread she'd managed by breaking it into task lists. Now the man who'd put her there was being held for questioning in connection with what appeared to be a deliberate attempt to compromise hospital infrastructure during a period when a federal officer was recovering in the ICU. The geometry of it was almost too large to hold whole. "Does Voss know?" she asked. "He's been briefed. Briefly." A pause. "He had some opinions." "I imagine he did." Carr almost smiled. It was the first time she'd seen anything close to it from him. His exact words aren't in the official record, but they were colorful. He stood up and began packing the recorder away. "You should know that what you spotted in that lobby, the 3 individuals, the direction they were moving, is potentially significant to the timeline of when the intrusion attempt began. You may be asked to provide a formal witness statement." "I'm willing." "I know." He clicked the recorder case shut. "General Marsh said you would be. She was right." He looked at her once more, and there was something in it that was more than professional. Not warmth exactly, but the particular regard of someone who had recalibrated their initial assessment and was acknowledging it without making a production of it. "You've had a long 4 days, Ms. Vance?" "Yes," she said. "I have." The news broke publicly at 6 that evening, not through the Millhaven Gazette this time, through a regional television affiliate that had clearly been working a source inside the hospital and had enough to go with a chyron that read, "Harlow Regional CEO fired, detained for questioning following patient safety incident and alleged network breach." The report was careful in the way that reports were careful when they knew more than they were legally comfortable saying, but the framework was accurate and the details they did include, the termination, the regulatory review, the federal involvement, were specific enough to be damaging in the particular way that facts were damaging when they didn't require interpretation. Cassidy watched the first 2 minutes on her phone in the hospital cafeteria, which was where she'd ended up after Carr's debrief, sitting at a corner table with a sandwich she was actually eating because she hadn't eaten properly in 2 days, and her body had begun registering complaints about that. She turned it off after 2 minutes. Not because she was indifferent to it, she wasn't, but because watching it felt like something she should do privately, later, when she could actually process it. Right now, she needed to eat and think, and let the various moving pieces of the last 8 hours settle into an order she could work with. Priya texted her at 6:14. "Are you watching this?" "I saw the beginning," she texted back. "They're saying federal involvement. What did you do?" She almost laughed. I spotted some people in a lobby. Cassidy, I'll explain later. She finished the sandwich. She got a second cup of coffee because the day was showing no sign of ending and she had given up pretending otherwise. She was staring at nothing in particular and thinking about the equipment list she'd need to compile before Friday when someone sat down across from her without asking. She looked up. It was Dr. Ruhi, still in her white coat, which meant she'd come straight from somewhere clinical, and she had the look of someone who had spent the last 3 hours managing the downstream consequences of a crisis and was running on the specific fuel of professional duty rather than anything physiological. She put a folder on the table. What's that? Cassidy said. The structural report on the trauma unit that's been sitting in Hollis's inbox since October. Ree pushed it toward her. He never responded to it. The department heads who submitted it assumed it was being reviewed. A pause. It was not being reviewed. It was being ignored because the proposed changes included budget reallocations that would have affected the Executive Hospitality Fund. Cassidy opened the folder. She scanned the first page. The language was administrative, but the numbers told a clear story. Equipment deferrals totaling $240,000. Staffing gaps documented across 7 months. A formal request for 2 additional senior nurses in the trauma rotation that had been submitted and then submitted again 4 months later when no response came. Who wrote this? She said. Mostly Marcus, Ree said, with input from 3 other senior floor nurses. It took them 6 weeks. She looked at the document for a moment, at the careful, detailed work of people who had done everything right, documented the problems, run the numbers, gone through proper channels, and had been met with administrative silence while the man responsible for the silence spent the hospitality fund on investor dinners. I want a copy of this sent to Ellery today, Cassidy said, and I want Marcus's name on the record as primary author. Already done on both counts. Ree looked at her. I should tell you, 3 more nursing staff have come forward since this afternoon. Different incidents, different dates. A doctor in cardiology is preparing a statement about a resource allocation decision last spring that he believes contributed to an adverse patient outcome. She paused. It's becoming a larger picture than just the 9th. Cassidy had suspected as much. The specific thing Hollis had done in that trauma bay wasn't the work of a man who had never done something like it before. It was the work of a man who had gotten away with smaller versions of it, enough times that his judgment about what was permissible had drifted somewhere very far from where it should have been. The regulatory review will capture all of it, she said. It will. Ree stood up. Get some sleep tonight. Tomorrow is going to be complicated. Is it more or less complicated than today? Ree considered this with genuine seriousness. Different kind of complicated. Today was crisis. Tomorrow is reconstruction. She picked up her coffee cup. You're better at crisis. So am I. The reconstruction is harder. She left. Cassidy sat with the folder and the cold coffee and the sounds of the cafeteria around her. The particular white noise of a place where people came because they needed a few minutes away from whatever floor they were on, and thought about reconstruction. She was almost at the parking lot when Carr called. We have a partial match on one of the 3 individuals from the lobby, he said. Private contractor, defense sector, formerly. His file is interesting. Interesting how? Interesting in the sense that he appears on a consulting roster for a healthcare investment advisory firm that is also on the list of investor groups that attended Hollis's tour on January 9th. She stopped walking. He was in the hospital on the 9th, she said. We believe so. We're pulling lobby footage now. Carr's voice was even, but had a specific quality of restraint in it, like someone carrying something heavier than they were letting on. If the connection holds, and I want to be clear we're still verifying, it suggests the events of January 9th were not purely about optics. That Hollis's behavior in the trauma bay may have been, in part, about controlling who was present and what information was accessible during a period when Colonel Voss was an unidentified patient. The parking lot was cold and the light was going, and Cassidy stood in it and let that sentence do what it needed to do. They didn't know who he was when he came in, she said slowly, but someone in that investor group might have. That's the question we're currently asking, Carr said. Don't repeat that. I won't. One more thing. He paused. Hollis's personal phone records from January 9th show 11 outgoing calls between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. We have records of 9 of them. We're working on the other 2. Another pause. One of the 2 we can't account for was made at 6:23. She calculated that against the timeline she'd been carrying in her head for 4 days. 6:23 was 9 minutes after the ambulance bay doors opened, 3 minutes after Hollis walked into the trauma bay, 2 minutes before he ordered her to stop compressions. He called someone while he was in the room, she said. We don't know that for certain. But that's what you're looking at. Carr didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Get some rest, he said. I'll be in touch tomorrow. She got in her car. The engine started on the second try instead of the third, which felt like an improvement, and she drove out of the Harlow Regional parking lot and onto Caldwell Avenue and thought about a man making a phone call in a trauma bay while someone's heart was stopped, while her hands were doing the only thing available to keep him alive. While 9 minutes away, people in suits were already on their way to a hospital with a hard case full of equipment designed to tap into a medical network. The snow had started again. Light, diffuse, the kind that accumulated slowly without announcing itself. She drove home through it. Her apartment was the same as she'd left it. The corkboard with the recertification courses, the window, the kitchen table where a general had sat and drunk her coffee 2 days ago. She made tea because she was done with coffee for the day and possibly for the week. She sat at the table and opened her laptop. She started the equipment list. Not because it was the most urgent thing, not because the regulatory review or the federal investigation or whatever Carr was going to find in those unaccounted for phone records could be addressed by a spreadsheet, but because it was the thing she could actually do at 9:30 at night in her kitchen, and because the list was real and the needs were real, and the work of reconstruction, which Ree had said was harder than crisis, and which Cassidy was beginning to understand was also more important, started with someone sitting down and doing it. She worked for 2 hours. At 11:47, her phone lit up with a message from an internal Harlow Regional address. She recognized as hospital board correspondence, Ellery's administrative account. It was brief. Ms. Vance, formal offer letter being prepared. Terms as discussed, plus equipment review scheduled Friday, 8 a.m. One additional item requires your attention. Please come to the executive suite at 7 a.m. tomorrow. There's something you need to see. She read it twice. Then she set the phone down and went to bed. She slept, which surprised her, and if she dreamed, she didn't remember it. Her alarm went off at 5:50, and she got up and made coffee, and was in her car by 6:40 with the equipment list printed and folded in her coat pocket, and a particular quality of forward momentum that was not quite certainty and not quite calm, but something that had elements of both. She arrived at Harlow Regional at 7:02. Ellery was waiting for her in the lobby, which was unusual. Ellery was not a woman who waited in lobbies. She was standing with 2 other people Cassidy didn't recognize, both in civilian clothes, both with the specific posture and credential lanyards of people from outside the hospital, and when she saw Cassidy, she crossed the lobby directly. Good, she said. You're here. What is it? Cassidy said. The unaccounted phone call from January 9th, Ellery said. They found the other end of it. She started moving toward the elevator without breaking stride, and Cassidy kept pace beside her. Who did he call? Cassidy said. Ellery pressed the elevator button. That's what's complicated, she said, because the number he called belongs to someone who is currently on our board. The elevator doors opened. Neither of them moved for a second. Which member? Cassidy said. Ellery looked at her and named a name. The name Ellery said was Warren Aldrich. Cassidy knew the name the way she knew all the board members. From the organizational chart she'd looked at once, early in her time at Harlow, when she was trying to understand the structure of the place she'd decided to rebuild her career in. Aldrich was the heavyset man who'd been at the table yesterday. The one who'd looked up from the transcript and asked Hollis, with that specific flat weight, "Did you say this?" The one who had looked, in that moment, like a man who was genuinely appalled. She stood at the elevator with that landing in her like something swallowed wrong. He was in the board meeting yesterday, she said. Yes. Ellery's voice was controlled in the way of someone who had already spent several hours being controlled about this and was running low on the resources required to maintain it. He participated in the vote to terminate Hollis. He voted in favor. While knowing he'd received a call from him on the 9th. While knowing that, yes. The elevator doors, which had been patiently open this entire time, began to close. Ellery put her hand out and stopped them. The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds, she said. At 6:23 a.m. Hollis's phone to Aldrich's personal cell. She looked at Cassidy directly. 4 minutes is a conversation, not a missed dial. They got in the elevator. One of the two people Cassidy didn't recognize, a woman in her 40s with a federal prosecutor's credential on her lanyard, whose name she would later learn was investigator Diane Folds, had been standing quietly this entire time with the patience of someone accustomed to watching other people process information before she was needed. She spoke now concisely. "We need to walk through what you observed in the lobby yesterday before we do anything else," Folds said. "Your account combined with the phone records establishes a timeline we can work with." She looked at Cassidy. "Are you okay to do that now?" "Yes," Cassidy said. The elevator moved. Dude, it took 50 minutes. Folds was thorough in a way that was not slow. She asked specific questions and listened to the full answer and only interrupted when she needed clarification, which was twice. The second investigator, a younger man named Torres who handled the recording, said almost nothing. Ellery sat at the far end of the conference room table and did not speak at all, which was itself a kind of communication. What emerged from the 50 minutes was a sequence that Cassidy could now see whole, where before she'd only seen pieces. Warren Aldrich had not been a passive recipient of Hollis's call on the morning of January 9th. According to the phone records and the communications pulled from one of the detained contractor's devices, Aldrich had been in contact with the investment group that sent the three men to the hospital, not as a board member performing oversight, but as an informal liaison between that group and Hollis's executive office. The investment group had a financial stake in a proposed data partnership with Harlow Regional, a deal that had been quietly structured over 8 months and that the full board had never formally reviewed. The deal required specific patient data architecture, the kind that lived in the East Wing Annex server cluster, the kind that a hardware tap would access silently and continuously. Colonel Voss, arriving as an unidentified patient with military-grade encrypted equipment, had created a problem for that arrangement. Voss, once identified, would bring scrutiny. Scrutiny brought oversight. Oversight was incompatible with a data partnership that hadn't been disclosed to the full board because Hollis and Aldrich had been operating on the assumption that it didn't need to be, because they were the ones who decided what needed to be disclosed. They weren't trying to hurt Voss, Folds said, with the particular flatness of someone being precise rather than reassuring. The intrusion attempt was about the data infrastructure. Voss being in the ICU was incidental to that. They needed the window of institutional disruption to move the equipment in. But stopping his resuscitation would have removed him as a future identification problem, Cassidy said. Folds looked at her, a pause that wasn't quite confirmation and wasn't quite denial. That's one interpretation of Hollis's behavior in the trauma bay, yes. We're not in a position to state motive with certainty. What we can state is that the call to Aldrich happened 3 minutes after Hollis entered the room and 2 minutes before he ordered you to stop compressions. Cassidy looked at the table. At the grain of the wood and the ring from a coffee cup that someone had left there, and the ordinary, unremarkable surface of a conference table in a hospital she'd worked in for 3 years, where a man had stood 6 feet away from her and said, "I'll accept that clinical outcome," while making a calculation she hadn't fully understood until right now. She had known it was wrong. She had known it with the specific, unambiguous clarity of someone who had been in enough situations where the difference between right and wrong was a physical fact rather than a philosophical position. But she hadn't known the depth of it, hadn't known that what she was pushing back against in that moment was not simply arrogance or vanity or the particular blindness of a man who had confused authority with judgment. She'd been pushing back against something more deliberate than that. "He knew," she said. "Not a question." "We believe so," Folds said. "To what degree and with what specific intent? That's for the investigation to establish." "How long does that take?" "Months, potentially. This is federal jurisdiction now, given Colonel Voss's status. It moves differently than a state regulatory review." Folds closed her notepad. But the regulatory review doesn't wait on the federal investigation. Those run in parallel. And what the review establishes, Hollis's interference with emergency care, the undisclosed data partnership, the documentation Dr. Ree and the other physicians provided. That's going in the report that goes to the State Health Board, and that report has its own consequences. What kind of consequences? The kind that end careers and close institutions, Fools said, or in this case, restructure them so thoroughly that what comes out the other side is essentially a different hospital. She looked at Cassidy with the direct, unornamented attention of someone who had learned to deliver hard information cleanly. That restructuring needs leadership, people who understand what went wrong and why, and are committed to the work of making sure it doesn't happen in the same ways again. She paused. I'm told you've already started a list. Cassidy thought about the equipment spreadsheet she'd been building at her kitchen table the night before, the line items, the dollar amounts, the specific unglamorous work of identifying what was broken and figuring out how to fix it. Yes, she said. Good, Fools said. Keep going. Aldrich was escorted from the building at 10:17 that morning. Cassidy didn't plan to be in the lobby when it happened. She'd been in a meeting with Ellery and the interim administrative lead about the Friday procurement review, and the meeting ran long, and when she came out of the elevator, the first thing she saw was the cluster of personnel near the main entrance and the particular quality of stillness that fell over a lobby when something was happening that people weren't supposed to watch but couldn't look away from. Aldrich was walking beside two federal officers with the specific posture of a man trying to appear as though the escort was voluntary. He was carrying nothing. His badge was already off. His face was doing the same thing Hollis's face had done on the elevator, controlled, managed, withholding. But there was something underneath it that Hollis's hadn't had, which was the particular quality of a person who had genuinely believed, until very recently, that they were too careful to be here. He saw Cassidy. She was standing 30 feet away near the corridor junction, and his eyes found her with the automatic recognition of a person cataloging the room. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the lobby of Harlow Regional Medical Center, while the federal officers maintained their patient, unhurried proximity, and the lobby went about the complicated business of being a hospital lobby. She did not feel triumph. She wanted to be honest with herself about that, because she'd spent 4 days hearing people tell her she deserved justice and watching the machinery of accountability grind slowly into motion, and there was a version of this moment that the story she was inside wanted to be. Cathartic, clean, symmetrical. The villain walks out, the hero watches. The score is settled. It wasn't like that. It was just a man who had made choices, being walked out of a building he'd helped corrupt, while the building continued to function around him because buildings did that. Because the patients on every floor above them had not stopped needing care, because the governance structure was being dismantled and reconstructed. Aldrich looked away first. She turned back toward the corridor. She had a list to finish. Pourtant, Osei found her in the trauma unit at 11:30. She was doing a walkthrough. Not officially, not yet. Her contract wasn't signed until Friday. But Ree had suggested it, and she hadn't said no, because the equipment request list was considerably easier to build when she was standing in the department looking at what was actually there versus what should be there. She had a clipboard. It felt strange and appropriate simultaneously. Osei came through the bay doors and stopped when he saw her, and something in his face did a thing she recognized, the recalibration of a person who'd been holding guilt at a manageable distance and was suddenly close to it. "You're back," he said. "Almost. Friday. Officially." She made a note on the clipboard. "The portable ultrasound in Bay 3 is 2 generations out of date. I've been writing that in quarterly reports for 18 months. I know, I read them this morning." She looked up. They went to Hollis's inbox. He didn't respond to any of them. Osei leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and looked at her with the tired, honest regard of someone who'd been in the same building as a slow institutional disaster and was still working out what it meant about his own choices. "I should have escalated outside Hollis," he said. "Gone directly to the board or the state health board. I had documentation. I had Ree's support. I told myself I was managing the relationship and— Raymond." She set the clipboard down on the counter. "I'm not interested in relitigating what you didn't do. I'm interested in what you're going to do starting next week." He looked at her. "The trauma unit's going to change substantially over the next year," she said. "That means the clinical protocols change. The resource allocation changes. The way decisions get escalated changes. She held his gaze. I need a department head who's been here long enough to know what's broken and who's not so invested in how things were done before that they can't adapt to how they need to be done now. A pause. You're the person I want, but I need you to actually want it too, not just accept it because I'm asking. He was quiet for a moment. I want it, he said. Good. She picked up the clipboard. Then help me with this list. The cardiac monitoring in Bay 1, also out of date, he said, pushing off the wall and coming to stand beside her. And the crash cart in the corridor has a defibrillator that's been flagged twice for calibration and hasn't been serviced. She wrote it down. They worked through the department for 40 minutes, which was the most functional 40 minutes she'd had in a week, because it was concrete and necessary, and the language of it, the specific language of equipment and protocols and the gap between what existed and what was needed, was a language she'd spoken her entire adult life in one form or another, and speaking it here, in this specific department, felt like something settling back into place. She went to see Voss at 1 o'clock. He was sitting up this time, not attempting it, actually managing it, propped against the raised head of the bed, with his arms at his sides and the particular careful stillness of someone who had learned exactly where the pain began and was operating just below that threshold. He looked better. Not well. The bruising was deeper and more colorful at the 48-hour mark, which was normal and looked worse than it was, but alert in a way that changed the quality of the room. He looked at her clipboard. Equipment list, she said before he could ask. How bad is it? Manageable. Nothing that can't be fixed with budget and attention. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. Which is most problems, honestly. He made a sound of agreement. Then, after a moment, Marsh told me about Aldrich. She tells you a lot. She briefs me. There's a difference, technically. He shifted slightly and kept the wince small. Were you surprised? She thought about it. Not entirely. The pattern made more sense with him in it. She looked at the window. The sky had finally cleared, the first real blue she'd seen in 5 days, pale and cold and very wide over the Millhaven roofline. I keep thinking about the fact that he voted to fire Hollis while knowing about the call. Covering his position, Voss said. He figured if Hollis went down completely, the board investigation would stop there. Hollis would be the story. He almost calculated it right. Almost. He looked at her. It was the timing of the intrusion attempt that broke it. If they'd waited another week after the board investigation closed, after the regulatory review was underway, but before it got to the data infrastructure question, he paused. But they got nervous. People who've been operating from a position of unchecked authority for a long time get nervous fast when that authority starts moving. She thought about Hollis in the trauma bay, the speed with which he'd moved, the investor tour, the call to security, the public termination in the corridor mob, all of it so fast, so unqualified, the reflex of a man who had been uncontested for so long that his first response to a challenge was to eliminate it rather than adapt to it. What happens to them? She said. Both of them, realistically. Voss considered the question with the directness of someone who'd spent his career adjacent to the specific overlap of federal law and institutional misconduct. Hollis faces state charges for the emergency care interference. That's the clearest case. It's on camera. It's documented. The federal piece depends on what the investigation establishes about his knowledge of and involvement in the data scheme. If he knew the full scope, he paused. The federal sentencing guidelines for conspiracy to access protected federal systems are not gentle. And Aldrich? Aldrich was more careful about paper trails, but the phone record is real and the contractor communications put his name adjacent to the planning. He looked at her steadily. He won't walk away from it. It's a question of how far it goes. Years, she said. Probably, he said. They sat with that for a moment, not dramatically, just letting it occupy the space it occupied. You're keeping the directorship, he said. It was not a question. Yes. Good. He looked at his hands. I want to say something and I need you to not deflect it. She braced herself slightly, which she suspected he noticed. What you did in that trauma bay, and I don't mean the clinical part, I mean the part where you looked at a person with institutional authority over your career and decided that authority did not extend to this. That's rarer than people think. He looked up. I've spent 20 years in environments where people make that calculation every day. How much authority does this person actually have over me in this specific moment? Most people, when they run the numbers, decide it's not worth it. They stop. They comply. They tell themselves they'll fight it later through channels when the stakes are lower. A pause. You didn't stop. He was going to die, she said. I know. And the fact that you experience that as a simple equation rather than a complicated one, he will die if I stop, therefore I don't stop, is exactly what I'm talking about. He shook his head slightly. Some people lose that. The military trains it in, and then life trains it back out. The institution trains it in, and then the institution trains it back out. The pressure to defer, to manage up, to calculate consequences before acting. He stopped. You hadn't lost it. She looked at the clipboard in her lap, at the list of equipment deferrals and staffing gaps and things that should have been addressed 18 months ago and weren't. I've lost other things, she said. It's not like I'm a person without damage. Nobody worth anything is, he said. I'm not describing a hero. I'm describing someone who, in one specific moment, knew exactly what mattered and acted on it without waiting for permission. He paused. That's enough. That's actually enough. She looked at him. The thing about being told you were enough by someone with the particular authority of a person who had nearly died and come back was that it went somewhere different than the same words from someone trying to be kind. It didn't resolve everything. It didn't close the file on her service record, or the things she'd carried from her last deployment, or the 3 days she'd spent updating a resume in a dark apartment. But it landed in a specific place and stayed there, and she let it. Rest, she said. Your blood pressure was still reading high this morning. I know. The ICU nurse has mentioned it. She's right. She stood up. I'll check on you tomorrow. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She picked up the clipboard. I'll see you tomorrow, Colonel. She was at the door when he said quietly, Cassidy. She turned. Whatever it costs you to rebuild that department, it'll be worth it. For the people who come through those doors after you. He held her gaze. Not for the ones who walked out on you. For the ones who don't know you yet. She nodded once. She walked out. The formal reinstatement happened on Friday morning. Not with ceremony. Cassidy had been specific about that when Ellery's office had asked about format. No assembled staff, no speech, no moment staged for institutional optics. Just a conference room, the contract, the equipment review, and the people who needed to be there. Ellery. Rishamasi Osai, in his new formal capacity. Fouls because the regulatory documentation required a federal witness. Carr, who arrived 6 minutes late and said nothing about why and nobody asked. And Marcus Reyes, who was there because Cassidy had put his name on the attendee list herself, and who sat at the far end of the table looking like someone who wasn't sure they were supposed to be in the room until Cassidy looked at him directly and said, You're supposed to be here. And he straightened in his chair and stayed. The contract was thorough. The equipment review was longer than Friday morning probably warranted, but nobody left early because the people in the room understood that what was being built here, slowly, imperfectly, through line items and signatures and the particular grinding work of institutional repair, was the foundation of something that would outlast the crisis that had made it necessary. She signed at 9:53. Ellery slid a badge across the table. It said, Cassidy Vance, Director of Emergency Trauma Services. She looked at it for a moment. It was a badge, a rectangle of plastic with a photo and a title. She'd had one before, a different one, a floor nurse's badge, which a security officer had taken from her outstretched hand while investors watched through glass. She clipped this one on. Nobody made a speech. Reese said, Welcome back, and meant it. Osei passed her a folder of the equipment approvals that had already been provisionally signed, which was his way of saying something he wasn't going to put into words. Marcus said, The crash cart's already been scheduled for servicing, and looked like he'd been waiting to say it for 3 days, which he probably had. Fowles shook her hand and said, The regulatory report goes to the state board on the 23rd. You'll want to have someone from your department reviewed it before it's finalized, for accuracy. I will, Cassidy said. Send it to me directly. Foulds nodded and left. The meeting broke up gradually, the way meetings did when there was real work waiting on the other side of them. Carr was the last to go. He stopped at the door. The investigation is going to be in the news again, he said. Probably next week. Hollis's name will be prominent. Aldrich's name will be in it. He paused. Her name will likely come up. I know. You okay with that? She thought about it. Not the performance of thinking about it, but actually thinking about it. What it meant to have her name in a story about a federal investigation, to be publicly associated with an institutional failure, even as the person who'd refused to participate in it. Yes, she said. Because the story is accurate. He nodded. That was apparently enough. He left. She sat alone in the conference room for about 4 minutes, which was a luxury she was not going to get very often once the department workload hit in earnest, and she let herself feel the weight of the week she'd just come through. Not to wallow in it, just to acknowledge it. The parking lot in the snow. The 3 days at the kitchen table. The phone call from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be a man who'd woken up in an ICU and wanted her to know he was alive. She had not done any of it for the badge. That was the thing she kept coming back to, and the thing she found most difficult to articulate when people, Ellery, Voss, Rahi, tried to name what she'd done as courageous, as exceptional, as worthy of recognition. It hadn't felt like courage in the moment. It had felt like the only available option. The math was simple. If she stopped, he died. If she continued, he might live. She knew how to continue. Therefore, she continued. What she hadn't calculated was the cost. She'd known there would be one. She'd known the second she felt Hollis's hand on her shoulder that what came next was going to hurt her in some durable way. But she hadn't run the numbers. She'd just kept her hands moving. She thought about what Voss had said. You didn't stop. And the way he'd said it, not with the breathless admiration of someone who'd never been in a hard situation, but with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who understood exactly how heavy the alternative would have been to carry. She thought about the version of her that had walked into that parking lot 5 days ago, coat on, box under her arm, alone in the snow at 6:30 in the morning, and she didn't try to talk that version of herself out of the grief or the fear or the crushing uncertainty of not knowing what came next. That had all been real. The damage had been real. 3 days of real had happened to her, and she wasn't going to let anyone, including herself, sand those days smooth into a lesson with clean edges. This was not a story about how things always worked out. This was a story about one specific set of circumstances in which accountability functioned when enough people, a general, a physician, a junior nurse with an email account and a conscience, a federal investigator, a board chair who was genuinely appalled, did their part of the job. It had almost not worked. It had come within a few minutes of not working, in a hallway where 3 people were trying to access a server cluster while a patient who knew too much recovered in the ICU. The system did not save her. People did. Specific, imperfect, tired people who made decisions under pressure and mostly got them right. That distinction mattered. It mattered because the thing you believed about how justice worked determined how you behaved when it wasn't working yet. If you believed the system would eventually correct itself without intervention, you waited. You managed the relationship. You wrote reports and sent them to inboxes and hoped. If you believed that systems were only as functional as the people inside them, you didn't stop compressions when someone in a suit told you to. She was in the trauma unit at 2 in the afternoon when the call came from the state health board. The regulatory report had been expedited. Fouls had apparently been more aggressive about the timeline than she'd indicated. And the board's emergency session had voted to place Harlow Regional under a provisional oversight period, which meant an independent administrator would review all executive decisions above a certain threshold for the next 12 months. It also meant the data partnership proposal that Hollis and Aldrich had been quietly constructing was formally suspended pending a full board disclosure review, and that any investment group with documented ties to the network intrusion attempt was barred from any future contracting relationship with the hospital. The official who delivered this information was careful and thorough, and ended by saying that the board had noted, for the record, the specific conduct of the trauma unit's nursing staff on January 9th, and that the documentation of that conduct would be included in the hospital's annual quality report. What does that mean practically? Cassidy said. It means it's on record, the official said. Permanently, as an example of clinical practice under administrative interference. A pause. It also means the interference is on record, permanently. as a failure of executive duty to patient welfare. She thanked the official and ended the call and stood in the trauma bay for a moment. The department around her was its ordinary afternoon self. 2 nurses managing a minor laceration in Bay 1, the monitoring equipment running its steady background presence, the sound of the ambulance radio from dispatch at the nurses' station. Ordinary, functional, present. She walked to the nurses' station and looked at the board. Current patients, current assignments, the logistics of a department doing what departments were supposed to do. Marcus was at the station, updating a chart. "The crash cart service is scheduled for Monday," he said without looking up. "And I sent the portable ultrasound specs to the procurement team this morning." "Good," she said. "What about the staffing rotation review?" "I started a draft. It's rough." "Send it to me tonight. I'll have notes back to you by morning." He looked up from the chart. He was 26 and had been in nursing for 3 years and had, at considerable personal professional risk, forwarded an internal communication to a fired nurse because it was the right thing to do. He looked slightly less like someone who wasn't sure they were supposed to be in the room than he had this morning. "Dr. Osei said you're restructuring the senior review process," he said. "Yes. Can I be involved in that?" She looked at him. At the specific quality of someone asking a question they've already half-talked themselves out of because they're accustomed to the answer being no. "I was going to ask you to lead it," she said. He stared at her. "You documented the department's needs for 6 weeks and submitted a report that was ignored," she said. "You know what's broken better than anyone else on this floor. I'd be doing less than my job if I didn't put you in the room where the decisions get made." He looked back at the chart. His jaw did something that wasn't quite composed for a moment, and then he pulled it back. "Okay," he said. "Yes, I'll do that." "Good." She picked up her clipboard. "The staffing draft. Tonight." "Tonight," he said. She walked back out into the bay. At 4:45, Osei appeared in the doorway of what was now technically her office, a small room adjacent to the main trauma bay that had previously been used for storage and still smelled faintly of cardboard, and said, "The news crew is in the lobby." She didn't look up from the procurement review. "Which outlet?" "2 of them, actually, local affiliates, and the Gazette called the main line." "Refer them to the board's communications office." "I did. They'd like a statement from you specifically." She set down the pen. She looked at the wall for a moment. The wall had a crack in the plaster near the ceiling that she'd noted on her first walkthrough this morning, and she'd written it on the list not because it was a clinical priority, but because it was the kind of thing that accumulated into the general message of a space that wasn't being maintained. "Tell them I'll have a written statement by end of day," she said, "and tell them it'll be short." What she wrote 40 minutes later was 4 sentences. "On January 9th, I did my job. The patient survived. The investigation that followed is ongoing, and I'll support it fully. What I want people to take from this is not a story about exceptional heroism. It's a reminder that the most important decisions we make are the ones nobody is watching, in the moments when stopping would be easier than continuing." Ellery read it before it went out and said, "It's very short." "I know. It's also exactly right." She handed it back. "Send it." She stopped by the ICU on her way out at 6. Voss was awake and had apparently been given clearance to sit in the bedside chair, which he was occupying with the careful discipline of someone who had negotiated the position with his medical team and was not going to waste it by moving wrong. He had a tablet on his knee and was reading something she didn't try to identify. "You're leaving," he said when she appeared in the doorway. "Department closes my shift at 6. "Does it really work like that for a director?" "Not usually," she admitted, "but it's my first day and I'm setting a precedent." She leaned against the door frame. "You look better." "I feel worse, which they tell me means the medication is wearing off appropriately." He put the tablet down. "I saw your statement. It was 4 sentences. 4 good ones." He looked at her. The last one especially. She thought about that sentence, about what it had cost her to write something that did not perform modesty and did not perform confidence but tried to say the actual thing, which was that the moment had not been exceptional. It had been a choice available to any person who had not yet let the weight of institutional authority convinced them that the authority was more real than the patient on the table. "When do you transfer?" she asked. 3 days, probably. Stable enough for transport." He paused. "There'll be a debrief about everything. The identification, the circumstances of how I ended up on that road, all of it. It's going to be a long process." He looked out the window. "And at some point in that process, what happened here will be part of the official record." "I know. I wanted you to know that what goes in that record about January 9th, about what you did, I have input into that." He met her eyes. "I intend to be specific." She looked at him for a moment. In the pale late afternoon light of the ICU room, he looked like a person who had been close to the edge of something and come back from it, which was exactly what he was. Imperfect and complicated and alive because of a sequence of choices made by a person who'd been standing in the right place at the right time and had refused to move. "Thank you," she said, and meant it as simply as it sounded. "I'll be back through Millhaven," he said, "when things have settled. I'd like to buy you a coffee." "I'll be here," she said. She walked out of the ICU and down the corridor and into the elevator and out through the lobby of Harlow Regional Medical Center, and the evening air outside was cold in the sharp, specific way of Colorado in January, the sky fully dark now and very clear, stars already visible over the city. She stood on the front steps for a moment, not savoring it, not performing anything, just standing there in the cold, breathing. The week she'd just lived through had not been a story about an exceptional person doing exceptional things. That was the version people wanted, and she understood why. It was cleaner, it had edges, it let the audience feel the satisfaction of a clear moral without having to sit with anything uncomfortable. The hero was rare. The hero was special. The hero was not you. That version was a lie she refused to tell. The truth was less satisfying and more important. She was a person with a specific skill set and a specific history and a specific stubborn resistance to accepting that authority over her title was also authority over her judgment, and she had been in the right place when someone needed that specific combination. A different nurse might have made a different choice. A different version of her, worn down by one more year of institutional indifference, might have hesitated a second longer. The margin was not as wide as the story wanted it to be. Which was exactly why the story mattered, because the margin narrowed every time someone was told to defer. And did. Every time a report went unanswered and nobody escalated it. Every time an institution decided that what it looked like was more important than what it was, and nobody said, "This is not acceptable, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." The margin narrowed, and someone would be on a table someday, and the nurse standing beside them would have been worn down to the point where stopping felt like the only available option. She thought about Marcus writing a staffing report over 6 weeks, about Osei documenting equipment failures and quarterly reports that went nowhere, about Rie carrying her records of Hollis's interference for months, managing the relationship, waiting for a better moment, about all the ways people tried to work within systems that were failing them, all the quiet daily compromises that accumulated into the conditions that made January 9th possible. None of that was cowardice. It was survival. She understood survival. But somewhere in the accumulation, the line had to hold. She had held hers. She pulled her coat tighter and walked to her car. The city around her was its ordinary evening self. Lights coming on in windows, traffic on Caldwell Avenue, the sound of the world continuing at its usual indifferent pace. Harlow Regional's sign glowed behind her. Tomorrow she would be back inside it at 7 a.m. with the staffing draft from Marcus and the procurement notes from Osei and a meeting with the interim administrator about the oversight period structure and approximately 40 other things that would not be resolved in a single day or a single week or possibly a single year. Reconstruction was harder than crisis. Ree had been right about that. It was also the only thing that made the crisis mean anything. She got in the car, started the engine, second try, as always, pulled out of the parking lot onto Caldwell, and drove through the January night, and the heat came up slowly, and the radio played something she didn't recognize, and the city moved past the windows, and she thought, tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. That was enough. That had always been enough.